Questions to the Prime Minister. Stephen Timms.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House would want to join me in paying tribute to Del Singh and to Simon Chase, who were tragically killed in Kabul on Sunday in a cowardly terrorist attack. Both were there to support the Afghan government and to improve the lives of the Afghan people. Del Singh was a friend to many in this House and had given so much time and dedication to troubled regions across the world. Our thoughts should be with their families and their friends at this very difficult time. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to associate myself with the condolences the Prime Minister expressed on behalf of the whole House. The Trussell Trust coordinates the fast-growing network, now numbering some 400, of church-based food banks, which between them provided food for 500,000 people just between April and December last year. Would the Prime Minister be willing to meet with representatives of the Trussell Trust to discuss with them the very big challenges that they're grappling with?
I'd be very happy to meet with them. We've listened carefully to the Trussell Trust. One of the things that they wanted to see done by this government, and indeed by the previous government, was to allow food banks to be promoted in job centres. We've allowed that to happen. That has increased the use of food banks, but I think it's important to do the right thing than something that might just seem politically convenient.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is aware of the tragic case of a 2-year-old boy taken to Chase Farm Urgent Care Centre at 3 a.m. for the emergency care he needed, but despite the best efforts of a senior nurse and the paramedics who took him to North Mids, he was tragically pronounced dead at 4 a.m. in the morning. I know we cannot comment on the case until a full report is published. But does he agree with me that the effect of reconfigurations, often put through despite local opposition, including from myself, is that we are asking people to decide where to go for help at moments of great personal stress, and into how we must do more to explain the choices so to help them decide? And would he finally meet with me on publication of the report to see if there are lessons that can be learned and changes made?
Well, I'm very happy to meet with my honourable friend. I mean, this is an absolutely tragic case, and I offer my deepest sympathies to Hashir's family. Anyone who's taken a desperately ill child to hospital in the middle of the night, when that child is at risk, know what an incredibly desperate time that can be. I understand the hospital is carrying out a full and comprehensive investigation into the circumstances around this poor child's death. I've asked the Health Secretary to discuss the findings from the investigation with my honourable friend once it's completed. We must ensure that everything is done to avoid these terrible incidents happening in future.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I want to start by paying tribute to the 2 British nationals, Simon Chase and Del Singh, who were killed in the suicide bomb attack in Afghanistan. Simon Chase had served Britain in the army, and my condolences go to all of his family and friends. And Del Singh was one of Labour's European candidates and one of the most decent people you could ever hope to meet. He was an international development worker who dedicated his life to helping people across the world, and we all grieve with his family. Mr. Speaker, recent reports of the murder of thousands of innocent civilians by the regime in Syria are a reminder of the horror unfolding there, and we all hope for significant progress from today's talks. Last month, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and I made a joint statement about the plight of Syrian refugees, which welcomed the government's leadership in terms of the aid programme. Now, the UN High Commission for Refugees has also called on Britain to be part of a programme to help resettle a small number of the most vulnerable Syrian refugees. 18 countries are part of that programme. Britain is not so far among them. Doesn't the Prime Minister agree that we should be?
Well, first of all, can I completely agree with the right honourable gentleman just how dreadful the news is that has come out of Syria in recent days about allegations of torture and worse in that country. I think we are fulfilling our moral obligations to the people of Syria. We are the second largest bilateral aid donor. The money that British taxpayers are providing is providing food and shelter and water and medicine for literally hundreds of thousands of people. We're also fulfilling all our obligations in terms of asylum seekers, and we've taken over 1,000 asylum seekers from Syria in recent months. We're also making sure that we can, where we can help very vulnerable children who are ill, including a child in a British hospital today, we take action there as well. I don't believe that you can solve a refugee crisis of this scale when you've got almost half of the 9 million population of Syria either displaced or at risk of displacement, with a quota system where countries are taking a few hundred refugees. But where I do agree with him is that if there are very difficult cases of people who don't belong in refugee camps, who've been either disabled by these dreadful attacks or in very difficult circumstances, I'm happy for us to look at that argument. Britain always plays the right role in these desperate humanitarian crises.
Ed Miliband.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer. And let me just make a few points in reply, because it's an important issue. Look, first of all, we're all agreed on the leadership that this government has shown in relation to Syrian aid, and I pay tribute to him, the International Development Secretary, and others. On the point about asylum seekers, those are people who have, of course, been able to get here. We're not talking about people who've been able to get here. We're talking about people who are actually in the refugee camps at the moment. On his point about whether this can solve the problem, of course it can't, but the UN is talking about a small number of the most vulnerable people here, including children who have lost all their parents and victims of torture. Now, I was somewhat encouraged by the end of the Prime Minister's answer on this. We're all proud of Britain's tradition in terms of taking refugees. Why doesn't he look again and say that Britain will actually participate in this programme and take just a few hundred refugees and indeed set an example?
I don't actually think there's a disagreement between us. The problem I see, let me explain, the problem I see is I think some countries are using this quota system as a way of saying, therefore I fulfilled my obligations. Now, when you've got, as I say, almost half of a 9 million population at risk of displacement, the fact that, you know, the Finns or the French or the Swedes are going to take a few hundred people, that is not fulfilling your obligations. Whereas the massive amount of aid that Britain is putting forward, the second largest in the world, I think is playing the most important role. But as I've said to him, I think there are individual cases where we should be looking, and I'm happy to look at those arguments and those issues, but let's not pretend that a small quota system can solve the problem of Syrian refugees.
I do feel we are gradually inching forward on this issue, Mr. Speaker. Look, let me be clear about this. Let me be clear about this. It must not be an excuse for failing to provide aid. Of course it must not. But we're not talking about either providing aid or taking vulnerable refugees. We're talking about doing both. Now, given the reasonable tone of the Prime Minister, will he now open discussions with the United Nations about Britain making its contribution to this programme? I think colleagues from all sides of this House want this to happen. Will he now say he'll do so?
I've made very clear we're prepared to listen to the arguments about how we can help the most vulnerable people in those refugee camps. But just to correct him, some of the countries that are participating include in their quotas both asylum numbers and refugee numbers, which I think is not the argument we should be making. Let me be absolutely clear. Britain is leading the world in terms of humanitarian aid in Syria. We should be proud of that. We're fulfilling our obligations on asylum claims, and we should be proud that we do give home to those who flee torture and persecution. And where there are extreme hardship cases, I think we should look at those again. That is the approach that we should take. I think there should be all party support for it, and I think Britain can be proud of the role that we're playing.
Ed Miliband.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope he'll take this away, and as I say, we'll open discussions with the United Nations. I don't think honourable members should groan on this issue. I really do not. We know that Britain can make more of a contribution on this specific issue, and I hope he'll open discussions. I want to move on, Mr. Speaker, to another subject. I want to move on. Today's welcome fall in unemployment is good for the people concerned. We welcome the fall in unemployment because whenever whenever an individual gets back into work, it's good for them and good for their families. I do have to say to honourable members, just braying like that doesn't do anybody any good. Now, can he confirm that today's figures also show that average wages are down by £1,600 a year since the election, meaning that for ordinary families, for many ordinary families, life's getting harder?
I think it is worth, Mr. Speaker, pausing for a moment over what these statistics show today, because what they show, youth unemployment coming down, long-term unemployment coming down, the claimant count coming down, unemployment overall coming down, but above all, what we see today is the biggest ever quarterly increase in the number of people in work in our country. There should not be 1 ounce of complacency. There's still a huge amount of work to do to get Britain back to work, but there are 280,000 more people in work. That is 280,000 more people with the security of a regular pay packet coming in for themselves and their family. Now, of course, we're seeing a slow growth in wages. Why? Because we're recovering from the longest and deepest recession in living memory. But I have to say, because the Leader of the Opposition keeps quoting the figure without the tax cuts that we put in place, he's not recognising that actually this year people are better off because we've controlled spending and cut taxes.
Mr. Speaker, all he has done is show that he is absolutely complacent about the situation. Because he's trying to tell millions of families around this country that they are better off when they know they are worse off. And it doesn't help for the Prime Minister to tell them the opposite. Now, let me take this figure. In Britain today, there are 13 million people living in poverty. That is a shocking figure. And what is scandalous is that for the first time ever, the majority of those people are living not in jobless families, but in working families. What's his explanation for that?
Well, the explanation for this is what the Institute for Fiscal Studies have said. And they said this: wages have increased much less quickly than inflation. As I say, that is not surprising. We had the biggest recession we had in 100 years. It will be astonishing if household incomes haven't fallen and earnings haven't fallen. The fact is we're recovering from the mess that they left us. Every week he comes here. He comes here and raises a new problem that he created. We had the betting problem, then we had the banking problem, then we had the deficit problem, and now we have the cost of living problem. He's like an arsonist who goes round setting fire after fire and then complains when the fire brigade aren't putting out the fires fast enough. Why doesn't he start with an apology for the mess that he left us?
Mr. Speaker, he comes here every week and does his Bullingdon Club routine, and all he shows is that he has absolutely no understanding of the lives of people up and down this country. That is the reality. Ordinary families are working harder for longer for less. He's cutting taxes for millionaires and not helping them. The minimum wage is falling in value. He can't be the solution to the cost of living crisis because he just doesn't understand the problem.
We are cutting taxes for everyone in our country. And we're only able to do that because we've controlled spending. What he cannot face is the fact the economy is improving. For months they told us to listen to the IMF. Remember that? 5 tweets in 1 month from the Shadow Chancellor, listen to the IMF. Now the IMF are telling us the economy is growing, stick to the plan, unemployment's going down, not a word. Remember, he predicted 1 million more unemployed, we got 1 million more people in work. He predicted the deficit would go up, the deficit is coming down. The fact is today, our plan is working. There are 1.3 million more people in work in our country. That is 1.3 million more people with the security of a regular pay packet. We are securing Britain's future, and it'll be put at risk by Labour.
Duncan Hames.
Mr. Speaker, the systematic torture and killing of 11,000 people detained by the Syrian state is surely a war crime. And as there can be no lasting peace without justice, will the Prime Minister resist conceding any immunity from prosecution for war crimes at the Geneva II talks which start today, so that the next time a tyrant turns on his own people, the deterrent of international law is not muffled?
I think my honourable friend makes a good point, and Britain is actually going further than that by making sure we play our role, not just in the humanitarian crisis that we've discussed, but also in collecting the evidence about war crimes so that people can be held to account for the dreadful things that they've done.
Mr. Steve Reid.
Does the Prime Minister agree with Lord Stevens and the Home Secretary that stop and search needs reform, or does his fear of Nigel Farage mean he'll block it?
Stop and search does need reform, because what the HMIC report shows is that in 27% of cases the police have not been following their own guidance in terms of stop and search. So we do need to reform stop and search. If it's necessary to legislate. If it's not, we won't. But what's really important is that stop and search is used properly, but we don't add to the burdens of the police.
Neil Parish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's rollout of rural broadband will double the number of homes and businesses that will receive broadband from 40% to 80%, but there will still be 17% of people left with getting full, fast broadband. Can the government work with me to deliver that extra 20%, because it is very much part of our long-term economic plan?
And my honourable friend is absolutely right, and for those of us who represent rural communities, broadband isn't just part of the economic plan, it's an absolutely vital part, because without that connectivity, small businesses and entrepreneurs in our constituencies won't be able to benefit. We've seen massive investment going into broadband. We'll shortly be setting out our plans for the £250 million announced in June to extend superfast broadband coverage to 95% of the UK by 2017. We're now connecting up tens of thousands of homes and businesses every week, all progress that wasn't made under the government opposite.
Nigel Dodds.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister accept that the remarks by the Irish Foreign Minister about the Haas talks and the possibility of some kind of intervention by his government is deeply unhelpful, that the vast majority of the issues at stake in the Haas talks are internal to Northern Ireland, they're matters for the parties in Northern Ireland to engage and agree upon, and there can be no question of an imposed solution, and that the most helpful thing that the Irish government could do about the past is to be more forthcoming about the role of the state authorities in collusion with the IRA.
Well, first of all, let me reassure the honourable gentleman there's absolutely no question of an imposed solution. The proposal for the Haas discussions was a proposal of the Northern Ireland parties themselves. Now, I obviously wish this process well. I think Haas did a good job in providing the architecture of a future solution on parades and on flags and on the past. I hope the parties can come together and continue the work. My right honourable friend, the Northern Ireland Secretary, will do what she can to help facilitate that work. I think it is important to go on discussing this with the government of the Republic of Ireland. They have taken steps themselves to come to terms with some of the things that happened in their past, and I think if the parties work together and if the British and Irish governments are there to help, I hope we can make some progress.
Simon Kirby.
Mr. Speaker, I am incredibly proud to represent a large gay community in my constituency. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that despite the views of some, that the weather in Brighton is nearly always very sunny?
My honourable friend is quite right. Brighton does have this superb microclimate that people should be encouraged to take advantage of. He stands up for all his constituents with great vim and vigour, and I think in reward it would only be fair if Brighton Kemp Town was actually put in place on the shipping forecast somewhere between Dover and White. I think we should get a reflection of this every morning.
Phil Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Tachi Rail Europe and Gestamp are working with Sunderland University to establish a university technical college in the constituency, and as the support of the Department for Transport, can the Prime Minister assure me that he will support the college and make sure that the decision is taken quickly on the bid so that the employers and young people can acquire the skills they need?
Well, I'm a great supporter of university technical colleges. I think they provide a really good new set of schools for our country to focus on vocational training and education. The new college announced last week, I think, is welcome news. It will open its doors in 2017, so I look forward to working with him on that issue.
Christopher Pincher.
Care and Igloo are just two more companies that have recently set up shop in my constituency, bringing hundreds of new jobs to an area where long-term unemployment has fallen by 35% and youth unemployment by 40%. Will my right honourable friend commend the good sense of these companies for coming to Tamworth? Will he encourage more to do the same? And will he consider visiting Tamworth himself so he can see for himself how our long-term economic plan is delivering results?
Always happy to visit Tamworth and spend time under the shadow of Sir Robert Peel, which is always welcome. I've enjoyed visiting his constituency in the past. But I think we are seeing a recovery, particularly in terms of jobs and particularly in terms of getting people off the unemployment register. It is worth noting that today's figures also show full-time employment up 220,000 compared with just 60,000 increase in part-time employment, and that shows people getting the full-time jobs that they want. But I'm happy to commend the businesses that he's welcoming to Tamworth.
Russell Brown.
Prime Minister, the green shoots of economic recovery are not being recognised across the entire UK. Does he intend speaking to the Governor of the Bank of England to make him aware of the fact that in low-wage economy areas, any signs or any increase in inflation would undoubtedly be would make a devastating impact on many households?
Well, the point I make to the honourable gentleman is, of course, we want to secure a recovery in every region of our country and every nation of our United Kingdom. If we look at Scotland, the last quarter, actually, the employment level went up by 10,000, and there are 90,000 more people in work than a year ago. So I think progress is being made, and the Scottish economy is performing, but we should do everything we can to help make that happen. If we want to keep interest rates down, of course, that is a matter for the Bank of England, but our role must be to continue the work on getting the deficit down. And in doing that, we have to make difficult decisions on spending, and it's not helped by the fact that all the difficult decisions we've made, not one single decision has been supported by the party opposite.
David T.C. Davis.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has suggested we learn lessons from the Welsh Assembly Labour government on how to run public services. With cuts to the NHS budget and the worst education system in the UK, does he agree that the only lesson we can learn from this is that those who care about public services should vote Conservative?
I think it is now possible to look very closely at the decisions that the Labour government have made in Wales, the decisions they've taken and the effect of those decisions. And if you take, for instance, the NHS, they haven't followed our approach of protecting the spending on the NHS. There's been an 8% cut to the budget in Wales, and as a result, they haven't met an A&E target since 2009. I also, with him, worry about some of the changes that have been made in education in Wales, because we want all children in our country to get the benefits of good basics in education, proper tests, proper league tables.
Anne McEachen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This weekend, Nigel Wilson, the Chief Executive of Legal & General, one of our biggest financial companies, urged the Government to abandon its Help to Buy scheme in London to prevent house prices spiralling out of control. Does he agree with Mr. Wilson that we should use the money instead to build new homes across the United Kingdom?
Well, we are building homes across the United Kingdom, but I think one better than what she suggests is what we've done, which is give the power to the Bank of England to specifically to advise on any potential problems in the housing market or indeed in any other market. We've actually cleared up the mess of the regulatory system that we were left by the party opposite so that proper warnings can be given in proper time.
Mark Horsey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under the party opposite, manufacturing was neglected and the sector halved in size. With this government investing in manufacturing excellence at the Manufacturing Technology Centre in my constituency, and the success of companies like Jaguar Land Rover and Rolls-Royce in important export markets, does the Prime Minister agree that a resurgent manufacturing sector is part of this government's long-term plan for the economy?
rebalancing our economy is absolutely part of our long-term economic plan. We want to see a balanced recovery, balanced between manufacturing and services, properly balanced between north and south, and making sure we win back these jobs and these orders from overseas. The companies that he quotes, like Jaguar Land Rover, like Rolls-Royce, they have the full backing and support of the government. They've got the investment going into the apprenticeship schemes that are helping them. We've reformed UKTI so we can help them sell around the world. We're doing everything we can to encourage them to bring jobs back into the UK, and manufacturing, exports and investment are responding well.
Michael McCann.
Mr. Speaker, as the Deputy Prime Minister knows, sorry is still the hardest word to say. But does the Prime Minister agree that Alex Salmond owes the people of Scotland an apology for a white paper?
I say to members on both sides of the House, this is supposed to be questions to the Prime Minister, not a Punch and Judy show. Mr. Michael McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But does the Prime Minister agree that Alex Salmond owes the people of Scotland an apology for a white paper that dodges the tough questions and doesn't explain that by adopting the pound, interest rates will go up because Scotland's lender of last resort will be a foreign bank?
I agree with the honourable gentleman that I think the white paper, which we were told was going to answer all of the questions, actually left the most important questions about the future of the currency, about Scotland's place in the European Union, about the future of defence jobs, about the future of financial services. It left all those questions unanswered, and I think that's why Mr. Salmond is struggling to get his argument across.
Robert Smith.
Mr. Speaker. Whilst we can currently celebrate record levels of investment in North Sea oil and gas production and all the jobs that it supports, we do have to recognise there's growing concern at the lack of exploration. Will the Prime Minister therefore recommit the government to its tax stability policy and encourage as much exploration as possible to ensure future investment?
Well, I can certainly give my honourable friend that assurance. It's very important that we make the most out of the asset that is the North Sea. That is what the Wood Report is all about, and we are putting those proposals in place. And I know that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will listen very carefully to what he says about making sure that the tax system for the long term encourages the maximum recovery.
Emma Reynolds.
Mr. Speaker, Del Singh was an extraordinary person, a warm and generous friend and a passionate campaigner for peace and justice. He dedicated his life to working for those in need in areas of conflict, including in Afghanistan. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that after the drawdown of troops this year, that the work of people like Del Singh will continue to be supported by this government?
I very much share what she said about Del Singh, and it reminds us of the risks that aid workers take on our behalf to deliver this vital assistance around the world. I can give her the assurance that she seeks. I think it's very important for everyone to recognise, while our troops are coming home at the end of 2014, our commitment to Afghanistan will continue. Our commitment to its armed forces, but also our commitment over $100 million a year in terms of our commitment to its aid and its future development. And so we'll need many more people, brave people like Del Singh, to go on working with the Afghan government to deliver for the Afghan people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Formula One team McLaren is the largest employer in my constituency of Woking. Would the Prime Minister like to join me in congratulating them on the hundreds of new jobs that they're creating locally, on the global sellout of their P1 sports car, and the £50 million worth of exports that they will achieve this year in China? Yet more examples, surely, of the success of British business and of our long-term economic plan.
Absolutely share my honourable friend's enthusiasm for McLaren and for the work of Ron Dennis, who very helpfully brought one of his cars to our great meeting in China, where we're encouraging investment into the UK. Of course, this is the very highest end of British motor manufacturing, but it is worth recognising that we've got a vehicle rolling off a British production line every 20 seconds. The British motor industry is doing well, this government's backing it, and long may that continue.
Andrew Slaughter.
Can I also thank the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition for their kind words about my friend Del Singh, a man who devoted his too short life to working for peace and justice, not least in Palestine and Afghanistan. But can I ask the Prime Minister this? new starts in affordable homes have fallen by a third since 2010. Why is that? Is it in part because Tory councils like Hammersmith and Fulham are demolishing council homes, the most affordable type of housing, and selling the land for exclusively private development?
Yes. Well, I'm afraid that he's got his figures wrong. Housing starts are actually 89% higher than the trough they left us in 2009. And when it comes to affordable homes, we've already delivered over 100,000 affordable homes. We'll deliver 170,000 in total by 2015. And the rate of affordable house building will soon be the highest it has been for 2 decades. Now, that is a massive contrast with Labour, where housing waiting lists almost doubled. And if he doesn't believe me, he might want to listen to this quotation, and guess who it's from. We refused to prioritise building of new social housing. Who said that? Anyone? The Leader of the Opposition. Thank you very much.
Mr. Damien Hines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister for his firm action against unscrupulous payday lenders and for driving the credit union expansion project? Would he now urge more employers to look at partnering with their local credit union so that many more people can access affordable credit and convenient savings direct through the payroll?
I want to commend my honourable friend for his consistent campaigning and speaking out on this issue. We are taking the tough action that is needed on payday lending, but as he says, the positive side of this is that we need to expand credit unions faster, and we should be looking at all the ways in which that can be done, including other organisations partnering with credit unions and encouraging their work.
Hugh Rankin-Davies.
Mr. Speaker, a report on the food aid crisis in the UK was commissioned by the UK government in February last year, was given to ministers in early summer last year, and yet is still being suppressed. What is the Prime Minister afraid of, and why doesn't he now publish and be damned?
But what this government is publishing today is the fact that we've got hundreds of thousands of more people getting into work, able to provide for their families and get the peace of mind and security that people want in this country. That is what we're publishing today, and that's real progress for our nation.
Last but not least, Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 45% of people don't pay their utility bills by direct debit. 1 million of them don't have bank accounts. Yet energy companies are charging, on average, £115 extra for people who don't pay by direct debit, hitting pensioners and the poorest the most. Will my honourable friend look into this, given that the government is doing everything possible by cutting energy bills by £50?
I'm certainly happy to look into this issue, because that is why we've taken the steps to compel the energy companies to put people onto the lowest tariffs, and we want to make sure that everyone can take advantage of that. As he said, we've also cut energy bills by £50 by rolling back the costs of some of the green measures, and we should continue to make this market more competitive, to give more choice to consumers and to encourage the switching, which happened a huge amount towards the end of last year, that has saved many people many hundreds of pounds.
Order.